All right. Well, listen, glad you're all on the phone today. I'll do my standard request if you can. Uh, Throw your video on. I don't care if you're driving. I will ignore if you swear at somebody while you're driving. It's okay, but sure makes for a more entertaining call when we can see everybody. Um, so I like to start every one of these off with just an opportunity to chime in with any wins that you've had over the past 2 weeks in regards to your business, contracts, negotiations, and of course, we have a whole slew of opportunities with, the national settlement and kind of a little bit of a retool on how we go about the business. Does anybody have any success with that over the past 2 weeks? Please, please, please. Okay. Well, yeah, go ahead,
Hey,
Jeff.
Matt, I do. Yeah.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
So I had sorry, I'm walking into the Union Park office right now. I had a win with an attorney as a new client. And it was really interesting to talk to him about essentially what attorneys call an engagement letter, right? Like
Right.
I can't act as your professional, I can't act as your fiduciary until we have an engagement letter. And it was really interesting how well this guy respected that. He was just like, because we talked about it, and then he asked me a real estate question, and then he stopped himself and he was like, "Oh wait, do we need to have like the engagement letter signed now? Because like I'm about to ask you a real estate question." And so anyway, it was really interesting to talk to like a professional in the industry who's been doing this for decades, and now that we got to start it, like I think this is going to become real simple, real easy for us, and we're going to navigate it, better and better the more often we do it. So it was really interesting to have that, kind of discussion with him from his perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I mean, we're really not oddballs by what has been, I air quotes, forced upon us. The reality is here in the state of Utah, especially, we really always had this requirement. It's now, there's obviously more definition around it. It is national now. I think we've mentioned several times on this call. There was like, I can't remember what the number is, but it was 19, 20, something like that. States in the United States didn't even have any agency agreements, which was mind-boggling to me to realize that so many states would function without this. And no wonder sometimes we diluted our own value proposition as realtors. Okay, so I'm going to stop here for a second. One of the questions I like to ask agents is, are you a believer? I mean, really. And I asked that question with intention because if you don't internally believe what you're about and what you're doing, that message carries through, right? um, think of the two most recent people that you met. One maybe that was very confident in what they did, and I don't mean arrogant. I just mean confident, and you felt, man, I'm in good hands, right? Versus the one that is just wishy-washy about what they do, and you're like, man, I don't even know if I want this person to do whatever it is, and that's true of us as professionals. All of you on this call are here because you believe in sharpening the saw, getting better at your craft, adding value, and doing a better job for your clients. I'm convinced of that because I see you here on a regular basis. And so I hope that that translates as you go out and work with the public to a degree of confidence. Be careful. Please don't let that transfer to arrogance and being annoying. But to be able to sit down and say, listen, thank you for taking this meeting with me. I hope by the time we're done here, you'll understand that you're in good hands with me because I really do. I'm neck deep in this. I'm vested in my craft, and I do it because I care about my clients and I want to do a good job. Right? That's a good starting, confident thing to say because, frankly, it's addressing some of the questions that are forefront of their mind, which is, do I really want Dee to represent me? Do I, and the answer, of course, is yes, because she's awesome. Um, but sometimes we get caught up so much in the minutia of, what this means, what that means, that sometimes it doesn't translate. We don't go walk ourselves through the process. And I mean that quite literally, walk ourselves through the process of before we meet with somebody and be like, am I good at what I do? right? Notice I didn't say perfect because it's always a little bit of a moving target. We always have to keep refining. But I hope as we go through these each week, you feel more and more confident as you get in front of people. I've believed for a long time as a principal broker with several different companies, my own company, that I didn't need to go in and pump up my agents, like a typical salesman. Come on, you get another listing, get another buyer. Well, personally, I just never wanted to run the business that way. And secondly, I knew that if I trained my agents to know what they were doing, that understand that they're about something significant in people's lives, and that they were well trained to help in that process, the confidence goes up, and I don't need to do any motivation. You just look for the opportunity. You see it in your agents. They're just like, oh man, I can't wait for the next person to help. Now, that's not some Pollyanna version where there's never a problem. You don't have that client that you're just like, oh my gosh, where did you come from? Of course, those are going to be there, but as a general rule, I hope you're excited about what you do. Okay. Go ahead, D.
This was
You're
me.
muted, D. There we go.
I have a good win last night. I worked really hard with clients back in Eden. I do believe in communicating with the other agent on the other side. I've written 2 contracts back there and they didn't go through. Last night we had to win $100,000 off list price and it's accepted. So we'll move forward. And that was a
Holy,
lot of work. That was pulling comps and giving as much supporting detail as I possibly could. I didn't think they would accept it and they did. There was no counter. So it was a good win. I feel good about it.
yeah, isn't that great? I
Yeah.
mean, it's great to get financial wins. It's even better when you're helping an individual, a couple, a family, whatever, and the potential is there to better their life. Just have you ever lived in a crappy place? I mean, individually, have you ever lived in a crappy place? What does that just do to your mentality? It's hard to stay up, and I think this is one of the benefits. We call it the intrinsic value of our occupation. Is yes, of course we're going to get paid, but the non-cash, the non-monetary value of what we do in bettering people's lives is pretty dang cool, right? And you bump into people. I don't know if you've had this experience. I've had it many times over my career where they're like, "Oh my gosh, thank you, thank you, thank you for getting us. Our kids have done this, and it's just been a great community for us to be in. And man, that feels good." So thanks
Hey,
for
Matt,
sharing that, D. Go ahead, Parker.
I just want to double down on this. D, congratulations, 100,000 off. Oh, dude, if they are not bragging about you online like our agent is the bomb, then you got to tell them to do that. So I to kind of double down on that on building value and understanding. I do think a lot of the times because we're so emotionally involved in the process of this that maybe when we fail or our offer doesn't get accepted and we start to feel like we failed, I think it is that can be a hindrance to actually creating success for ourselves and for our clients. Emily Moffett Brahman, her and I just got off a one-on-one. She's on my team. She's an incredible agent. She had an experience, and Emily, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but she had an experience where she was working with a client, showing them homes, and was really spending time in the market with them. And her clients were like, "Hey, no, we're just not finding what we like, but we got there's this for sale by owner over here that we were working with before we met you. We're going to go back and we're going to go ahead and negotiate with them and go under contract with them." And I went under contract with them. And Emily's like, "Okay, I wish you the best of luck." Went under contract with them, and that seller didn't know anything about their septic tank, or this was a cabin in Camas. Didn't know anything about their septic tank or the perk test or the size of their propane tank. None of these really important things. And what ended up happening is they ended up canceling the contract with that for sale by owner, going back to Emily and saying, "We've learned so much from you that this guy couldn't even answer, and we wouldn't have known how to ask those questions if we hadn't spent time with you. And so now we want you to help us fully find a property that works for us." And I think that's a really good example of building our value, right? And then obviously Emily could have gotten discouraged when they were like, "Well, we're going to go check out this first sell by owner now that we've learned so much from you, peace, right? Which is essentially what they did. But when they came back, it was a reminder like, oh, wait, we build value even when we don't think that we're doing that, just by instinctively growing within the business. So these types of meetings and these types of things really do build our skill set and increase our value in the consumer. And we need now more than ever is the time where we need to show that value.
And you
So
know what? You're spot on, Parker. This is a time, right? Whether you love it, hate it, I don't honestly don't care. It's just a situation that has been forced upon us to where we can demonstrate our value in a more poignant way now. So yeah, thanks. I love this part of our calls. I love hearing the successes. It means we're doing things right. And you know what? Your team member could have been snarky and said, "Well, go fine, go to," you know what, man, the number of times people circle back when we handle it well, be like, "Hey, listen, you know what? Thank you for the time you gave me. If you run into any snags, feel free to reach back out. Keep the door open." It's kind of like kids. They'll come back eventually. All right, let's move on. Okay, so here we are. What are we? Three plus weeks post settlement, and you know what? Some things are getting ironed out, and you know what? We're still dealing with some issues. So this is not going to be a full training on the ERSs and EBBs, but there are a couple things I wanted to touch base. It's kind of incremental learning as we go, from week to week. So I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully, no, we don't want to see that. You don't want to see the MLS, and I do want to bring up my PDFs and go to this. Okay, so here is, let me zoom in just a little bit. This is the ERS, and I wanted to just touch on a couple of things on this. So I hope you all heard my broker minute or two talking about the two pathways, the two predominant pathways to compensation. Sometimes I paint with a broad brush. Of course, there's 10 different hybrids, but as a general rule, all right, I'm going to put this out to everybody. What are the two pathways for compensation? This should roll off your tongue. It should be like just a Pavlovian response. What are the two pathways for getting compensation?
The seller's brokerage pays me or the buyer pays me.
Right. What documents?
Oh, well, I would use section 4.1, but initially you're talking about the buyer broker agreement to secure.
Well, so in the REPC, you're talking about 4.3, right?
Yep. Sorry.
Scroll down here. 4.3.
Still learning it.
Yeah, that's okay. 4.3 and the REPC, it's very straightforward. The downside to it is, I'm not going to cover this again. The downside is, to some degree or another, you potentially lose negotiating power, right? Because they know you're interested in the property, and you're also now negotiating how much they can pay. Does that give?
Hey, how are you?
I'm going to mute Amber. Okay. Does that give you more or less power as the seller when you know somebody's already interested in the property? Obviously, the answer is it gives the seller a little more power. So I've had this discussion with the attorneys at UAR, and I'm like, listen, you're right. You're going to see a fair amount of people on commodity type homes where there's not anything unique or there's not a high commission amount. Yeah, you know what? If I can bounce somebody from one condo in Vineyard to another condo, I'm not going to worry too much about putting compensation in the REPC. Okay. But if it's a unique property, if there's high compensation or whatever the case may be, you may want to get the brokerage payment agreement signed first before sending over an offer. Now, those are not the things I wanted to talk about. What I wanted to talk about is this section and some things I have been seeing. And before I get into my 1, 2, 3 here in the margin, I wanted to talk about this section 2.1. Let me just go back for 2 seconds here. This is our old buyer ERS, right? And section 2 was labeled, the whole thing was brokerage fee. And just roughly speaking, the way this worked was we would put a total brokerage fee amount up here, known as the brokerage fee, And then we would further articulate what portion of that brokerage fee we would offer out by way of buyer's brokerage compensation, right? We all know this. This is the way we did business forever. We even screwed this up from time to time, just for the record. But what I'm seeing now, both external and internal to the company, is I'm seeing some people coming up here and they're treating it like the old ERS. And they're putting up here, of course, it's a non-standard amount, but I'm going to use a nice round number to demonstrate the point. They're putting 6% here. And then in section 2.2, they're putting 3%, just like they used to do in the old exclusive right to sell. What's the problem with that? Anyone?
The problem is they're paying 6% and 2%. It's like 8%.
Yeah, that's right. Whatever is in here in section 2.1 and what's also in section 2.2, assuming that there was a signed written agreement, that's the third part here, then they're additive. And your seller, if you're representing the seller, can you imagine the conversation you're going to have when you have this fiduciary of reasonable care and they hired you because you're the pro and you just didn't put things in correctly, and all of a sudden they're on the hook for 8 or 9% when they thought the max was going to be 6%? Whoo, that's going to be a bad day. Probably not going to be a lifelong client. I'm just saying. So please, please, please be aware. I'm going to pull it up one more time. This old exclusive right to sell, where we would put the total amount here and then subset here, has gone away. It doesn't exist anymore. Now we already break it out and divide the total brokerage fee into this section and this section. Just remember, there is no total overarching fee anymore. There is the seller's portion and there's the potential buyer's brokerage portion.
Okay, so Matt.
Yeah.
If I'm going to a listing and I say, hey, seller, it's always a good idea to offer compensation to the buyer. That compensation to the buyer's brokerage. That compensation doesn't have to be determined right now, even though here are some different case scenarios to kind of wrap our head around it. That compensation is negotiable. So would it be appropriate at that time then to create an addendum to the ERS that essentially says that verbiage is,
hold that thought, Parker.
Okay.
I know where you're going and I want to do this in sequence so it makes sense, but I will come back to that, I promise. Okay, here's what you need to remember. Remember, we were talking about two pathways. One is through the ERS for the buyer's brokerage to get paid, right? From the seller directly. And then there is also the pathway via the ERS section 2.2, but there's a condition. The condition is that there must be a written, that's this section right here, a written compensation agreement between the two brokerages. That's why we have the form, the real estate brokerage compensation agreement. Now, this almost goes backwards, and that's why I put the 1, 2, 3 in the margin. Notice this key phrase here, in the event, right? You need to pay attention to terms like that in a contract because usually something significant follows after words like that. And what it says is, listen, in the event that the company, that means us, the listing company, agrees in a written compensation agreement with who? I know that I got a lot of stuff going on here on this form. To pay a buyer's brokerage. So that's the event, that's the hurdle that needs to be jumped, right? In the event that the selling brokerage agrees to pay the buyer's brokerage a compensation, as long as this green section, as long as it doesn't exceed the amount that is written in 2.2, right? Well, if those are all met, then what? Here's what it says. Then the seller agrees, oh my gosh, the seller agrees that the payment amount in 2.2 will be added to the brokerage fee referenced in 2.1. So if you're tracking what I'm saying here, you're going to laugh at this. So in this particular scenario, in the event that the hurdle is jumped, we then almost quite literally go back to what we used to do in the standard brokerage fee in the old document. Does that make sense? I mean, Sorry. Did what I just say make sense? I'm not saying does it make sense what the national settlement has done. It
Stop
really does.
complicating this, Matt. You're going to make my brain explode.
Okay, is anybody having problems understanding that,
No, I'm
hey,
not.
if this event is covered, meaning there's a compensation agreement signed between two brokerages, then because the seller signed off on 2.2, and then if that condition is met, then it's simply added to the total commissions paid in section 2.1. I mean, that's why I did the 1, 2, 3. You have to jump the hurdle, then you take what's in 2 and you add it to what's up here in the third step. Okay.
Matt, this is James.
Good morning, Bob Starks.
What is the seller actually agreeing to in that section when they actually have to agree on
Yes, that'll be fine. I'll get it
in the REPC?
3:30.
I'm muting him. Sorry.
Okay. When they actually have to agree to pay the commission in the REPC, what does this commit them to? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought that up. I just wanted to get the 1, 2, 3 in order so everybody understands that if there's a written agreement between two brokerages, the seller's agreeing that they're going to add that amount in 2.2 all the way up to 2.1. Now, to your question, James, section 2.2. So first of all, 2.1 by itself simply says, I, the seller, am going to pay the listing brokerage this amount if they close a house on my behalf. Right? And we could stop there if that was the only situation that ever came up. But section 2.2 goes on to say, hey, I, as the seller, I'm authorizing the listing brokerage to offer compensation to a buyer's brokerage, but I'm going to put guardrails on it. It can't go past the amount that I agree to here in section 2.2. We're good through that, right? Everybody's okay with that. It further goes on to say, yes, it's going to be based on gross acquisition price. And what it says, if you look at the yellow section there on 2.2, it says, what is the seller agreeing to outside of the money? The seller is authorizing the company to advertise or otherwise communicate that the seller and or the company is offering to pay compensation to the buyer's brokerage, right? And it has parameters on that. Can't exceed the amount in section 2.2. So backing up, 2.1, seller says, yep, I'm going to pay the listing brokerage. Section 2.2 says, yep, I'm also going to let my seller's brokerage, let any interested buyer's agents, buyer's brokerages know that I am willing, depending on the offer, right, to pay up to X% or X dollars based on the gross acquisition price. And then section 2.3 basically says, okay, and so how does that actually take place? And this is the further detail. Since the seller's brokerage now has the authority contractually from the seller, they can then, with power and authority and an agreement, sign a written compensation agreement with a buyer's brokerage. Again, assuming it doesn't exceed the amount that's in 2.2. And if all of those things happen, then the seller is on the hook contractually to go from, let's say, 3% in section 2.1 to a total of 6% on the event that the listing brokerage signed a broker to broker compensation agreement for 3%. So it's unfortunate that there's so many steps, but when you understand, this is the overarching thing that I hope will make it make sense. Why did the DOJ, what was the intention of their agreement in this regards? It was to make sure that the amount that was paid to a buyer's brokerage, was always negotiable. And so that's why we had to get away from just an ironclad, hey, before an offer is ever received, it's already contractually obligated, to the new version, which is, okay, the seller's portion is already negotiated, but the buyer's portion, especially this little phrase here, in amount up to this amount, made it flexible, so we couldn't be accused of price fixing. And then the conditions where this amount up here would actually become obligatory to the seller to pay.
And
So-
Matt, does 2.3 would only apply though if the REPC has that amount uh, agreed to, right?
No, no, I'm glad you brought this up. This is why I started off with the 2-pass. If you do what's in the REPC, right, let's call that pathway 1. There's specific verbiage in the REPC. Let me bring this up here that says who's going to pay whom. The seller shall contribute to the buyer's brokerage. Notice it bypasses the listing brokerage. This is an agreement between the buyer and the seller paying the buyer's brokerage on behalf of the buyer's obligation. So it literally circumvents, bypasses what's in the ERS, except for how much we as the listing brokerage are going to be paid. Okay, so that's why I say that's pathway 1. It's very straightforward because it's the seller paying the buyer's brokerage directly, having nothing to do with the ERS. Pathway 2, which is this ugly one, I say ugly because there's so many markings, is, okay, let's assume for a minute there's nothing negotiated in the REPC, right? And by the way, I've had this question several times. Notice it says, if no box is checked. So you do not have an incomplete contract if neither percent or dollar amount is not checked. In other words, the seller doesn't have to agree to any compensation in the ERS. So that's the scenario we're talking about now, pathway 2. Pathway 2 is, oh, we do have an ERS, and if the two brokerages prior to a REPC sign a brokerage payment agreement, then via this pathway, both buyer's brokerage and seller's brokerage will be paid by what's in these 3 sections. So there, for the purpose of what I just said, pathway 1 and pathway 2, they're mutually exclusive. You use one or you use the other. Okay. Now that I've said that, and I've made that 100% clear. Lori, did you have a comment?
Matt, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Let me close my door. My office is loud. So being a TC, we get a lot of different variations of the contract coming across.
Yeah.
I had one that came across with the REPC on that new section. They had put numbers in both sections, but only checked boxed one of them.
You're talking on the REPC.
Yes, on the REPC.
Okay.
So I'm assuming then that the one with the checkbox was then going to be the one that is enforced rather than the other one that isn't checked, even though there's one both.
Yeah. So you know what? You bring up a great point, Savannah. I sat on the forms committee for a couple of years, and you try and cover every situation, and you think, since we're all logical people, that we would understand the word "or" in a contract. But everybody on this call knows that not everybody reads all of the language in a contract. And so they just, yeah, that's the compensation section. I'm going to put 3% and 295, right? Without reading the paragraph, realizing it's an or, not an and. So what would we do if you want to do 3% and 295? You need to addend section 4.3E to say the word or changed to and. Right.
It seemed as if like it was calculated, so it was going to be like a 3%, commission, but then they did the dollar amount as well. But now, since we've got a different purchase price, it was a flat dollar amount. So then the 3% isn't applicable, and the agent is now going to be short like an extra $1,000.
Yeah. So you as a TC and us as agents on the other side, and this is what Ron Snow said when we did our training. If you see stuff like this, be a good actor. Don't try and put one over on somebody. The reality is, most of the time when you try and put one over because they made a clerical mistake, it usually surfaces before closing, and you're going to deal with it anyway. And it's probably going to be a lot uglier then. So if I was an agent and I had received an offer like that, and there was what would we call this, contractual ambiguity by the way they wrote it, I under my fiduciary of reasonable care to my client would say, hey, Savannah, what did you mean by this? Because it appears kind of confusing, right? That would just be like, should be standard protocol. But specifically to your question, when it says, you know, or, and only one of them is checked, I'm not saying you would avoid a fight, right, on this when you get to closing, but if you got down to brass tacks in the four corners of the contract, which is a legal contractual doctrine used in court, it would be easier to make the case that I only have to, as the seller, I only have to pay the box that was checked, right? And someone would be like, well, it was written in there, it just wasn't checked and it's reasonable. Well, there's another doctrine, four corners of the contract versus reasonableness doctrine. And I'm telling you, four corners of the contract tends to be more significant, more important because it's more specific.
Yep.
So anyway, good question. Now listen, back to your question, James, I wanted to finish up on this. I just painted two scenarios. There's pathway one, which is the ERS, which is very clean, right? Very clean. And it stands by itself. You don't need all this other stuff. Or if there's not compensation for the buyer's brokerage negotiated in the REPC, then there's pathway two, which uses the language in the ERS, section 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3, combined with the hurdle that must be jumped, having a written compensation agreement between the two brokers, then you're covered that way. Now, the scenario I didn't want to jump into because it tends to make people more confused, we call them the hybrid scenarios. What happens if, Stockton, what happens if you reached out to me as the listing broker and said, hey, Matt, I want to put an offer in and I need 2%, right, if we're going to do this deal. So we sign a broker-to-broker compensation agreement. But then your your buyer insists on putting 1% to bring it to a total of 3 in the ERS. Which one governs? Trick question.
Both.
Both. There you go. You nailed it. Yeah, because there is this crazy language in the REPC that says that the two will add together, right? Where are we here? Blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah. In addition, it's in green there. In addition, so whatever's in here will be added to any other compensation agreed to by the seller's brokerage to the buyer's brokerage. Notice we're now talking two brokerages there. So it's very specific. It's talking about pathway two. If there's something agreed to in pathway two and there's something agreed to in the REPC, they're added together. And yes, have we already seen that? Yep. And we have to have those calls where it's like, did your seller really want to pay the buyer's brokerage 6%, or do we have a problem going on here? Right? Unfortunately, you guys, you are well ahead of the curve. There's so many of our peers that have just kind of kicked the can down the road and are not paying attention to this. And so, like it or not, you guys being the pros, you get to do a little bit of teaching along the way, a little bit of mentoring and saying, hey guys, this isn't how we do it. Try not to come across as arrogant. Just be like, hey, we've actually done some pretty extensive training in our brokerage. You may or may not be aware of this. You can certainly verify it with your broker, but it looks like we have a potential problem here. Let me explain to you why. Right? Would you be offended if I took that approach with you, Stockton? Or would you feel like you and I are working together to do a smooth transaction?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's the whole point, right?
Matt, James again. I'm sorry to. Let me give you a scenario. If my seller agrees to up to 3%, and then I get an offer that says, in this case, they want the seller to contribute 2%. The buyer's agent wants 2%. They've never asked me about the seller's willingness to pay a commission. They're asking for 2%. If we sign that, the seller's now on the hook for 5%. How do you?
I'm going to give you some clarification on that, and that's why I was driving this point home. So I'm going to restate what you said to make sure I have it right. So on the one hand, we signed an ERS with our seller, right? And we said, you're going to pay me, the listing broker, listing agent, 3%, right? Up here in this field, okay? And you're allowing me to advertise up to 2% or 3%, whatever, down here, right? And so we've got authority at that point and then a buyer's agent sends you over an offer in the REPC, right? That says, hey, need you to pay me 3%. Am I good so far, James? Is that the scenario so far?
Well, I think the buyer's agent is asking for 2% in the REPC.
Okay, so he's asking for 2%. Here's my question. Even though we have 3% here in section 2.2, did you, in your scenario, did your brokerage sign a brokerage compensation agreement between the listing broker and the buying brokerage?
No.
Then your seller is only on the hook to pay 2% to the buyer's brokerage. The only way that this becomes contractually obligatory is if they jump the hurdle of what's in 2.3, which is very specific. In the event that the company, meaning the listing company, agrees in a written compensation agreement with the buyer's brokerage, right? That's the only time what's in section 2.2 becomes obligatory.
That's where it is. Okay.
Okay. And you are asking such great questions because these are the questions that are being asked by so many people. So I'm hoping you guys are going to be my little minions and get the word out there and educate our peers so we can get past this phase of the settlement and get back to doing business,
So
with intention and with power. Yeah, Parker.
So Matt, I on a few listings, I've had agents send over written compensation agreements before they even submit the offer. Now, I've already relayed to them that my seller has already agreed to, to pay a compensation of XYZ. And so I'm hesitant to have my client sign any type of additional compensation agreement that's not reflected on the REPC. Is that okay, or should I be looking at that and saying, oh yeah, we need to get this signed? Because I don't want to obligate my clients to more than what we've already talked about in our scenarios. So I want to be really cautious about. Plus, I don't know really. Sometimes I don't know what that buyer's agent is going to make an offer of compensation for.
Okay. So this is a good question.
I'm asking, when do we get really excited about that, and when do we exercise caution?
Yeah. So such a good question. Kind of attacking this from a different angle. It's the same topic. We're just looking at it from a different angle now. So in your scenario, Kyle says, hey, Parker, you got a great listing. I want to go see it. He goes and sees it. And then he says, hey, Parker, I want to send over an offer. But before I do, and this is totally reasonable, I just need to ask, how much compensation is your seller willing to pay? Can you tell him that? Or are you breaching a fiduciary of confidentiality?
No, it says that it says in the ERS that I'm allowed to discuss.
There you go. There you go. You have authority to talk to an amount up to what is specified in section 2.2. So surrendering that, Kyle had just asked you, hey, I want to send over an offer, but to avoid an awkward situation with my buyers, you totally know what I'm talking about, Parker, don't you? Blah, blah, blah. Can I send you over a brokerage compensation agreement for the 2% that you said your seller's willing to pay? What's your answer?
Currently, right now, I'm like, you can send over whatever you want.
Hey, there we go. Yeah. And in regards to managing expectations, I would just suggest you add this verbiage. Hey, Kyle, thanks so much. Appreciate the interest in sending over an offer. And yes, I will send over a signed compensation agreement between your broker and my broker. But you do know, just let's make sure we're on the same page. All of it being paid out depends on the offer. Don't forget to say that part, because that's why the DOJ has said this is all negotiable now, right? If Kyle came in, Parker, and was $50,000 under your purchase price, what is your seller going to want to do in most situations? Okay, let's make it more reasonable. 10,000 lower.
I mean, I don't know if it's 10 or like 10 or 50.
Whatever the number is.
Yeah, I don't know if it really matters. My seller is going to say, well, let's look at all this and give me a net sheet.
There you go.
That's the first thing he's going to say.
That's right. There's going to be some version of that conversation, and you may go back to Kyle and say, hey, Kyle, really appreciated the offer. We thought, you had told us you're going to be close to purchase price. We weren't expecting it to be $15,000 low. That's putting a crunch on my seller. He's willing in that situation to pay, 1.5% or whatever. So
Okay.
Stop there. So hold on, stop there for a minute. How do we handle that? You sign a new one of these for 1.5% if it's agreeable to Kyle, right? Because down here in section 7, it said, whatever the latest one is that's signed, it supersedes and replaces all previous agreements, right? So just because you signed one for 3%, right, doesn't mean you can't sign a new one for 1.5%. You okay with that? Everybody understand that?
Matt, why would I want to mess with the compensation agreement when what I would really want to say is put all the terms in your REPC and we will evaluate those terms along with all the other terms.
Yeah.
And I don't know why I even need the compensation agreement when I tell them that my seller's willing to pay up to 3% if the other terms are acceptable. So put it all on one document.
Okay, I'm going to give you one scenario, James. I've used it before, but I'm going to use it again. And there's probably 20 different iterations. And Andy, I see your hand. I'll get to you as soon as I finish this scenario. My wife has a higher end listing down in Summit Creek in Woodland Hills. It's $3.7 million. There's 3% commission offered on that. You know, you're closing in on $120,000 of commission. Yes, that was a shameless plug. Somebody go buy my wife's listing down in Summit Creek. Daddy needs a new Harley. But in that scenario, James, is it reasonable? You're dealing with a higher end client, and there's, like I said, there's potentially $120,000 of commission in play. Are you going to wait until we show you show your buyers my house and we capture on Alexa how excited they are about the house and they've just got to have it because the view is ridiculous and the outdoor jacuzzi, oh man, it's going to be awesome. And then you send over an offer and you say, yeah, I want 3%. What if the seller comes back at that point and says, dude, they want this house so bad. We're not going to have to pay 120. Let's offer them 40,000. Is that reason? I mean, is that something that could reasonably happen? Yeah, it could. And so I'm not saying this is the end all be all for all situations. Like I said, if it's a commodity sale, there's 12 condos in Vineyard, all of the same maker and all the same bedrooms, baths. Can I put it into a REPC in that situation? And if it doesn't work out, bounce to another of the 12 properties? Sure. But either a situation where the property is highly unique and your people have to have it, or there's a lot of compensation that you want to make sure that that's covered before you lose some negotiating power to whatever degree that is. That's the scenario. Those are the scenarios where I think people will be using this compensation agreement. Does that make sense, James?
It makes sense that that's your. I think at the end of the day, they're going to accept all the terms or not, and I don't know why having that compensation agreement with 3% in advance helps. But I understand what you're saying.
Well, let me put a finer point on it. If you were the listing agent, James, with a $3.7 million house, there's not buyers in that category are not climbing out of the woodwork, right? And so you're probably going to want to play ball with me. And be like, James, Brady builds a ridiculous house. It looks really nice. I think my people might be interested, but we're also looking up in Heber and Midway and a few other places. But they're the type of people that they'll move fast. And you've done this a good long time. Just so you know, I don't want to have an awkward situation where they fall in love with a house and we haven't figured out what compensation is. And then I have to go to them and say, hey, by the way, you've got to bring $60,000 to the table because James Seller isn't going to, pay out the amount that's on our buyer broker agreement. Is that a fair conversation for me to have with you as another agent?
I understand. I guess I'm assuming that I trust when you say that they'll pay up 3%. I'm assuming I don't have to have a piece of paper, but I get it. I understand.
Yeah, you're a good man, James. I'm more jaded.
Matt, I know it's Andy's turn, so
that's okay. Yeah, that's okay. I'm going to call a trump card here and just say Haley goes before you, Andy.
It's totally Andy's turn, but I kind of hear you talking out of both sides of this situation. To Parker's point, you're saying, yeah, I kind of support that idea of not obligating your seller until you see the numbers. So there's a little bit of discouraging the listing agent from actually signing that, having their client sign that. But then if you put it through on the REPC, you've already showed your hand. Well, it's really no different if they won't sign it before you have to send the REPC anyway.
Well, one,
Haley, so
hold on a sec, Parker. One, I'm just personally hurt that you said I'm talking out both sides of my mouth, but that's okay. I can take it. You're right. I am talking out both sides of my mouth because I'm trying to show alternate viewpoints. I'm not advocating any one of these is the way. I think it's important for us to know the ways that people will use it so we can act accordingly. And I will stand by what I said. On commodity sales, I would say all day long, go ahead and use the REPC. You're not really losing any negotiating power. But I think there at least exists at least a higher probability that you lose some negotiating power on a unique property or property, higher end property, or fill in the blank, whatever your unique non-commodity scenario is. And in those situations, I'm just going to do, I want to make sure I don't go show these people a bunch of houses or a few houses only to figure out after the fact, after they fall in love with it, which now is going to reflect on me when I say, oh, you know what? I didn't do my due diligence. I didn't check with James beforehand to see what the compensation was. And I know you're now in love with it. And we're going to put it into a REPC and cross our fingers and hope the seller plays ball. Right? This is
well, I totally agree with that position.
Yeah.
100%. What I'm questioning is the advice to the listing agent to not have the client sign it until they see a REPC really the best advice?
Did I say that?
Well, to Parker's point.
Sorry, if I said that, no, I would not advise my seller not to sign this. Are you kidding? I'm going to try and catch as many fish as I can. Right? Because my dialogue on this document with a seller is going to be, hey, Haley is my seller. Haley, the good news is we can sign this, but it does not become obligatory to us unless we accept a REPC. So if the offer comes in low, if it's not to our liking at the timeline or whatever, we can circle back and modify this. Right? But the key is we need to do it before the REPC is accepted. So we're still in the driver's seat as the seller. So we don't really lose as the seller. We don't lose our negotiating power by signing this.
Okay, that's what I wanted clarification on.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought that up. Hey, Parker.
Andy. Let's let Andy
hunted
talk.
on Andy.
It's okay. You can ask. Go ahead, Parker.
Oh, thanks, Andy. You're very generous. Anytime you want to hang out, just let me know. Hey, yeah.
Drinks are on me. I get
it. To Haley's point, it's really, well, I guess what I'm asking, and this kind of, me and Haley are, I guess, kind of on the same page with this is, when I'm talking to my seller, I'm saying, look, it's always a good idea to pay compensation. What that compensation is will be dependent upon the offer and you determine what that compensation is going to be, right? Is it fair for me to, I mean, obviously we want to be ahead of the game. Look, compensation at 3% is great. You're going to get someone who's really vested. Compensation 2.5%, probably the same thing. The reality is I'm leaving compensation up to how the agent values themselves. Meaning, if the agent says, I'll do it at 2%, but the offer is kind of crappy, or whatever the case is, then I go to my seller and say, hey, this offer is just okay, and this guy's only offering 2%. He's discounting a little bit because he feels that that's where his value is. So what do you think about that, seller? Do you want to pay this 2% or not? We haven't really determined a price, right? We haven't really determined compensation. So the question is it better to have a discussion that says, these are the case scenarios, let's sign something breaking down these compensations?
Okay, hold on. So I totally appreciate that. And I'm not going to pick on a particular scenario because I know we just make these up on the fly to demonstrate a point. But it's always going to, for me, it's always going to be like, here's what I'm seeing. How do you, as my seller, feel about it? I'm not going to like steer you and tell you until you ask me, well, how do you feel about it? But in that scenario, Parker, I would just say you still have the negotiating, even if you sign this, right? Prior to me showing your house and writing an offer, if you sign this with me for 3% and then my offer came in $15,000 less, do you have to sign the REPC? Does your seller have to sign the REPC? No, you still have the same negotiating power, right? And in fact, you could turn around to me and be like, "Hey, Matt, really appreciated the offer, but the seller at that price is not willing to pay out the 3% that you sent over and that was signed." Am I doing anything wrong at that point? Not at all. It's all negotiable, right? And so then that's going to precipitate a conversation just like you were talking about. It's like, so can you bring up the offer price so that we can, get your buyer the home that they want and also cover the compensation that's owed to your brokerage, right? This is the beginnings of negotiation, right? And don't throw down the gauntlet and don't dictate things, ask questions, right? Explore what is possible.
To add to that, I just think this compensation agreement is valuable because an agent can tell you whatever they want and it's not binding. We don't have any enforcement anymore. We don't have any contractual anything anymore. And this compensation agreement is what creates that.
Yeah, this is not binding until not only is
the REPC is signed.
A REPC is signed, which then invokes the ERS that if it goes through to closing, then the seller's obligated to pay. So yeah, see, you guys are getting it. It's not super.
It replaces the MLS cooperative agreement as a one-on-one.
They should relabel. I agree with you. They should relabel this document. This is the BAC replacement document.
Yeah.
Right? Even when there was BAC, it still was contingent on us accepting a REPC, right? So you're right. That's a very succinct way of putting it. Okay. Wow, you guys have totally destroyed my agenda today.
Andy's turn.
Andy.
I still got a question. Okay, I have a listing right now that I just received an offer on over the weekend. The buyer's agent used the old REPC, not the new one with Section 4 in it, the updated Section 4. So they didn't ask for any compensation. So the question I have is do I now we had listed this property with the intent of knowing that my buyer or my seller knows that they're going to be negotiating. We already had the conversation about a BAC and all of that. However, on the original listing, we went live before August 17th and it was a 0% BAC, knowing the intention was to negotiate. So now we've got this offer. The old listing before the change was 0%. Now so there's never been a commitment to commissions. How do I handle that I don't want to cost my seller money, my fiduciaries to them to get the most. I wouldn't ask somebody, hey, your buyer didn't ask for closing costs. Are you guys sure you don't need some closing costs? Why would I bring this up to them at all? Or just
hold on. Hold on. You're asking a very good question. And I would rephrase your question. You talk about our fiduciary of reasonable care and doing what's in the best interest of our client, right? That's kind of the biggest overarching fiduciary. Well, what is it they really want to do above all else? What does your seller want to do?
Sell their house.
There you go. They want to sell their house. So if I see a pathway developing that puts that in jeopardy, I would dare say it's my fiduciary, with the blessing of my seller, to reach out to the other side and be like, hey, is this really what you meant? I mean, because we had 0 BAC before the 17th, right? Mm-hmm. And you didn't put anything in pathway 1, the REPC, section 4.3, and you didn't have us on pathway 2 sign a brokerage compensation agreement. Are you working for free?
Yeah, and the buyer is putting a large, it's $400,000 house. They're putting down a couple $100,000, so it's not out of their wheelhouse to be able to pay it.
Exactly, and so I just think this discussion, you guys, is this one in particular, I think, is just so germane to the good agents versus the bad agents, the ones that have longevity, the ones that have SOIs that repeat and refer. It's not about, because I hear this, and I know you're not advocating this, Andy. I hear agents be like, well, my fiduciary is to make as much money for my seller, not at the expense of blowing up the deal, right? And so you have to know your alternate pathway. Under that same fiduciary, it's reasonable to go back to my seller and be like, hey, I know you guys need to get this home sold. I know you're planning to move within the next 2 months. I got to tell you about something that developed here, and then I want your feedback on how to proceed. Does that make me look like I'm a pro? Right. Instead of getting to the closing table or getting close to the closing table, and then it blowing up, and the seller's like, "What the hell happened? How did you were supposed to be like the Sherpa of this transaction? What happened?" Right? It's going to look badly on me. They're not going to repeat, and they're not going to refer, and you're not going to have satisfaction in your occupation. So the point being is, huddle with your seller, have a meaningful conversation, explain to them what's developing, ask for their feedback and how they like to proceed. This sounds so pedantic, so rudimentary that, oh yeah, we all do that. No, we don't. We don't. Sometimes we just kick the can down the road and hopefully nothing materializes. And more often than not, the negative part does materialize and then we look poorly. So just a reminder to everybody, have the conversation. It's under your fiduciary of reasonable care, especially if it has the potential of blowing up a deal. Go talk to your seller. Right? Get permission to talk back. Yeah, Mike.
Is it okay or the level of progress to ask the buyer's agent if they have an EBB with them receiving compensation from their buyers?
Oh, yeah, that's totally within our purview now.
Because if they do, then we're out of the woods and we don't have to worry about our seller compensation.
Sure, and I would say good, better, best, Mike. Right? Good is to do what you just said. Better would be to be like, hey, I'm not seeing how that. I just want to get an affirmative confirmation from you, right? So is your buyer just going to pay your buyer brokerage fee because you didn't put anything in the REPC nor in a compensation agreement?
Right, and then step two, what you were saying.
Correct. And you know what? They may turn around at that point, Mike, and like, yeah, you know what? We wanted to come in with a strong offer, didn't want to get into multiple offer situations, so we didn't ask for any compensation. They're going to pay for me. I've done tons of deals with these guys, and so I'm reducing my commission, and they're going to cover what I'm owed. Oh, that never happens. It happens pretty regularly. So don't do other people's thinking for them. Go find out.
Matt.
Right? Hi, Giselle.
Matt. Hi. I'm going to jump into a meeting with my accountant, but I wanted to just say one thing. I know that there's going to be all different kinds of scenarios with everyone dealing with buyer's agents and most likely buyer's agents that are clueless because they don't have a broker like you. Can we just maybe think for a second, put yourself in that buyer's agent's shoes, know that we're all going through a learning curve, handle every single situation with grace. Make sure that you understand that not everybody is as smart as you, and make sure that you're doing what Matt's talking about, is making sure that the transaction is progressing. But I can see already that there's agents that are going at this like, oh, that agent's so stupid. They don't know how to do it. They don't know how to fill out the forms, and feeling like that's going to be a benefit to the seller. It's really not, because at the end of the day, just live the golden rule and make sure that you are treating the situation and even the other side, the buyer's agents that might not know exactly the right way to do it. Just give them some grace because you want people to give you that same grace. Okay, amen. Bye.
Hey, that's an awesome comment. Ron echoed that in our trainings. And listen, here's the thing, you guys, and maybe we finish on this because that's such a positive note to finish on. If you want longevity in this business, if you want to sleep well at night, knowing that you do well in the business, and I don't mean just financially, the financial will come if you run your business right. I will always advocate for that. Ron Snow will always advocate for that. Daryl will. Life is short. Your reputation is important. And can you imagine if you treated somebody poorly on a transaction where you got one over on them and 6 months, a year, 2 years later, they've got a listing that your client just has to have? Yeah, that old thing that old saying that what goes around comes around. Don't live your real estate life by that premise and be fearful of what bridges you just burned. I love the fact that I can't keep everybody happy, but I tried throughout my career to maintain friendships and respect because I just know it's going to come back. And it has over and over and over again. So I hope you do the same. Your knowledge will be helpful, and it's your personal relationship equity will go up with people outside of our organization when you do what Giselle just said. It's like, hey, you know what? We're all doing the learning curve. Did you consider this? Right? That's a good place to be. You sleep well at night.
Hey, Matt,
yeah.
One last thing can we just talk about? I know we're over, so I want to do this quickly, but this is the only place I can ask this question because there's so many of us on here. For those of you who are listing properties, or maybe those of you who are representing buyers, have you at any time used Aligned to ask what compensation is? Because I'm getting that a lot on my listing side, and I'm obviously not responding to it because I know Aligned is not the place that we should be doing that. But I think it's really interesting how many questions I'm getting off of Aligned showings after a showing has been requested, where I'm getting questions of compensation. Can we talk just for a brief moment about the etiquette?
Andy, did we ever get to your question?
Yeah, we answered it.
Okay. All right. Phew. Parker, it's a good question. I'm going to just give you a big umbrella guideline on this. Anything that is attached to the MLS, of which a line showing is, best not have any discussion of compensation. I talked about this in our 4 trainings we did, our initial trainings. This is only round 1, guys. If you're doing crap like that, you're setting yourself up to be part of round 2. And make no mistake, you and your company are not a small enough fish that you will go unnoticed. Once the precedent has been set with lawsuits, lawyers are much like realtors. They see the opportunity and they replicate and duplicate and look for opportunities. So please don't put anything like that. We've all seen the little memes of, the description of the property, 3 bedrooms, blah. All right. Don't do it. The door is open for us to have open conversations about compensation. So just do it. Okay. You guys are great. I'm going to leave you with one last positive, super positive. I ran across this stat, right, recently in some NAR graphics. Do you realize that 2023 and 2024, which are almost identical to each other, 4 million homes sold annually is the same level as in 1995? Our normal volume is just a little north of 5 million homes a year. So for the past 2 years, we are at 30-year lows on sales. And you're like, Barton, why is that good news? The good news is I also share with you guys the probability matrix on where the Fed is projected to have rates. And by January 29th, 89% probability that we're down a point and a quarter. That takes rates down to the low 5s. And so I hope that gets you excited, because a good chunk of your peers are this month and into October checking out, and they're going to go dormant for 3 to 4 months. And that's going to be the 3 to 4 months where those rates are starting to click in. There's 3 Fed meetings during that time frame. And, you guys are going to be well positioned to take advantage of that if you keep working. So keep working. See y'all.
Thanks, Matt.